Hello, and thank you for joining me on the video today. Um, as you can see, I talked to you a little bit about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and just how I see it from a Christian perspective. This is going to be controversial, obviously, as many of my videos are. This is just my opinion and how I understand things. And it's taken me a long time to think about, is this something that Christians should be aware of, and how does this all play into Bible prophecy? How should we view this? What is the lens that we should look at this through? And so I just want to cover some of these things today, and I hope it's a blessing for you. I hope that it gives you a different perspective and kind of shows you a little bit about um, why, to ask yourself, why are we told the things that we're being told? Who does it benefit? Uh, and what are they trying to, what is trying to be hidden from us? I think that anytime we get a narrative about something, um, we have to do our own due diligence to find out what is the truth, or what is more true, if we can't get uh, the whole truth, in a situation, and to ask ourselves, okay, so who benefits from us believing what is being said? And I think that as Christians, and just people who want to know what's going on in the world, I hopefully this will help. So this has been almost a year going, and I guess what kind of tipped me off in the beginning is nothing really seemed to make sense to me. I was listening to all this information coming in, and I just kind of sat there and I was like, okay, well, this doesn't really. If I was in front of the people who are, whether they be military experts or, quote unquote, or governmental experts talking about these things, I would have more questions that I would have want to ask, and that's kind of when those questions start rolling around in my head, I kind of pay attention to them. So if you followed me for any specific period of time, you know that in July 2021, I think it was, I did a video on the six seals, what's going to happen next, and I think it was in my video where I cover seal 2, where I said that Russia would invade Ukraine. So this was 6 months, 7 months before the actual invasion. Now, at the time that I did the video, I was just kind of looking for things that could spark war. So that, which is why I said, okay, in SEAL 2, we see nations go to war. And so that's why I said, I believe that Russia would invade Ukraine and China would invade Taiwan. Now, as it's played out, one has happened and it's been over a year, and yes, there's still thought that China will invade Taiwan, but it didn't happen as close together or kind of the way in 2000 in 2021 that I thought it was going to. And that's one of the things about Bible prophecy is that God's timing for things isn't our time. I think that as human beings, we want things to happen a lot quicker. We see things forming, and we can kind of see, okay, well, this thing, and it should come real quick, or you think it's going to happen faster, but that's just not how. That's just not God's timing. I think that a lot of us have experienced in our own lives where we needed the Lord to answer prayer or come through, and it almost seems like right at the very last millisecond of, you know, that like just has to happen if and if not, we're going to fall down. That He's there to catch us, and I think that that's the same thing with when we look at world events and Bible prophecy. And I'll show you just how long you know we've kind of seen these things start to form together, and it's been decades. I and sometimes it just 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 seems to be like, Lord, let's get on with this, kind of thing. And of course, everything happens in His own time. but we want to be good stewards. We want to, and I think that that's what God allows us to do, is to give us time to realize what's going on, to be able to get out the word, to be able to help people see the bigger picture, so that they will know that these things were long predicted. And but it takes time for us to be open to asking questions, to be open to looking at different things, and just kind of mulling these things around. And so that takes time. And so one of the things that when the invasion finally did take place, I was surprised to hear that like the U.S. was warning Ukraine and the Ukrainian government and Zelensky that like Russia's gonna make a move. And I was surprised to hear that they didn't believe it was going to happen, and then it happened. And so what this told me was that the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian army, they were just not prepared. They were just living life as they normally would have the day before, and thought, okay, you know what, like this isn't anything really new. And then it happened. And then so when all the news media and everything, and all the experts and pundits and talking heads were saying, okay, within 48 to 72 hours, Russia's gonna take Ukraine and take Kiev, and it's going to be a bloodbath. And they expected 5 million people were going to, I think it was like 5 million people that were going to be killed. There's some like terrible, or maybe it was 500,000. Anyways, a large number of people are going to be. This was going to be like over a long weekend, blitz attack. And I saw news articles comparing like the Russian army and its troops and equipment, and how they had surrounded Ukraine, and then what the Ukrainian army looked like. And again, hearing that they weren't prepared, that they weren't getting ready, for this imminent attack. And just so then I thought, okay, well then this is gonna be terrible. But 72 hours, like, it should pretty much be done. And so then the 48 hours turned into 72 hours, and then turned into a week. And then it started being like, okay, well, why hasn't Russia dominated the situation, like it was expected? And then the stories like failing equipment and logistical issues, tanks are like vehicles running out of gas, and just like in Russian soldiers giving up, and all this and so there was this idea of Russian incompetence, right? Like that they'd made this big show, but now it was like very anticlimactic, in what was unfolding. And that didn't make a lot of sense to me, because they had been amassing troops for months. Like I said, in July of 2021, I was like, yeah, this is going to happen. So this like so the and so I was like, okay, okay, sure. You kind of maybe got off to a slow start. You run into some unexpected issues, you fix those issues. Like, you have 300,000 troops, I think, at the time that the invasion started. Like, you've been feeding them, you've been making, like, you've had all this time to make sure your vehicles are up and right. Like, you have months and months and months of gathering these forces, and then all of a sudden it's like a fizzled up balloon or whatever. Like, it just dies right there. Like, it's like, well, that was uneventful. And that narrative didn't make sense to me, because, okay, sure, like I said, maybe you stumble out of the gate, but you get things, or turned around, and then you're like, okay, so maybe instead of 72 hours, maybe it takes you know whatever, 300 hours or something to take Ukraine, or whatever it is, because of these issues. But that never happened. And then the narrative of, well, then Ukraine is like, Ukrainian forces are fighting hard and they're holding back the Russians. And the reports that I was seeing was that Russia never sent in the whole 300,000 troop army. Like, they sent a portion of it. Maybe they even sent up to half of their army, but they never sent in all of them. There was a lot of equipment, a lot of troops that just stayed where it was. And and so like none of this stuff seemed to make sense to me. Like, okay, if you're going to blitz Ukraine, and yes, maybe then the Ukrainian forces are giving resistance more than what you had expected. Well, then what do? You send the rest of your then you send the rest of the troops you've gathered, the rest of the equipment, and okay, fine, they've hit some resistance, they hit a little bit of a brick wall, but then you just bulldoze the wall, and that never happened, and then it like I said, all the reports starting to come out didn't make sense, and then okay, so then in March and in April and May, there's all these countries, Turkey saying, they'll mediate for peace. Israel is saying they'll help mediate for peace. And there's these talks of different peace talks where the two sides would get together. And so we're going to get into all of this. But where we are today, I think that it's just a very different situation than what was first told, and just these nagging questions about the whole situation. What I was hearing was like, this doesn't make sense. I'm not buying what you're trying to sell me, and that makes me feel uncomfortable. And my BS detector is like, I got to figure out what's going on here. So how did we get here? How do we end up in this situation? Where do I think it's going? What do I think is going to happen? And how does this apply to the biblical worldview, and how we should view um, this type of situation, and what's probably going to unfold in the days ahead? So one of the things that has been told is that Russia has always been the bad guy in this. It's always been Russia has wanted to expand. It's wanted to recreate the former Soviet Union. It's wanted to take Ukraine. They tried it in 2008, I think, was the first for Georgia, and then 2014, Crimea and the Donbass, and then here we are today. To take the narrative is that they're going to take the whole country, and then if they take and I think part of the thinking was if they took Ukraine quickly, then the fear in Europe that Russia would expand even further. They would have this momentum. They would have been just plowed through Ukraine, and then what country comes next? And that's why NATO had to be prepared. At least that's what we've been told. But again, I want to share with you a different story. So when talking about, you know, the different sides about what is NATO looking for, what is Ukraine looking for, what is Russia looking for, when these peace talks started happening, I saw that there were, I think, 3 or 4 things that Russia wanted. First, they wanted to resolve the Donbas, Crimea area of Ukraine. They wanted to sell that. They wanted to have peace in that area, and that it would become Russian territory. Then they wanted Ukrainian troops out of those areas. And they wanted assurance that Ukraine was never going to become part of NATO. And those were the points that were sticking to, on Russia's end. That's what they were kind of wanting to have as the peace agreements. And of course, what did Ukraine want? Well, it wanted Russian soldiers out of Ukraine, and the war to end. So okay, so those are the talk. Those were the points. But then it started saying, okay, well, any country, including Ukraine, has the right to join an organization. Like if Ukraine wants to join NATO, it has every right to join NATO. And sure, okay, like I get that, but it's also known that Ukraine is on the border of Russia. So if you have a defense organization like NATO that was created to oppose Russia, and now you have missiles, you have troops, you have all this military equipment on your border. Like people say, it's like China setting up their military bases and missiles, and everything in Mexico. Well, Mexico is free to come up with an agreement with China, and it's their country, and they have the freedom to allow China to come in and put, but those types of things, military equipment, troops, bases, all that kind of stuff. But again, on the world stage for world peace, that you're not going to allow that to happen, and Mexico probably wouldn't do that, even though they would have the freedom. And Ukraine understands this. They have understood this, that look, we're quarter country that borders Ukraine, Russia, borders Russia, and so we could do this, but it might not be in the best interest of world peace, or definitely peace in Europe, to have Western and American troops right on the border, with missiles and all that kind of stuff on the border of Russia. So the so and then there's this talk about, well, what did NATO promise when it first started? And there's been a lot of speculation. Well, NATO never promised not to expand. That's just a myth. Well, according to the LA Times, the op-ed here is, Russia's got a point, the US broke a NATO promise. Well, what was that promise? Well, in early February 1990, US leaders made the Soviets an offer. According to transcripts meetings in Moscow on February 9th, then Secretary of State James Baker suggested that in exchange for cooperation on Germany, US could make it ironclad guarantees that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. Less than a week later, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to begin reunification talks. No formal deal was struck, but from all evidence, the quid pro quo was clear. Gorbachev accepted to Germany's Western alignment, and the US would limit NATO's expansion. So there was a conversation, there's memos, there's documents that NATO would not expand. The LA Times is not known for its pro-Russian viewpoints. It's not pro-Russian propaganda, and yet here they've done an article, and you can look it up and read the rest of the article for yourself. And so these types of things, I was like, okay, so this happened. So what happened then, if we go back in 2014? What that happened, that started the war in Ukraine. Well, in 2010, we see the Ukrainian presidential election on February 7, 2010. This is how it was broken up. You can see a clear divide between pro-Ukrainian government and pro-Russian government. So Ukraine as a nation, even going back, and I only went back to 2010 because I wanted to know how did we get to 2014. But what we see is that Ukraine was a divided country, and you had leaders running that were more pro-Ukrainian, and leaders that were running that were more pro-Russian, and you saw a clear divide in the country to that effect. Go to 2014's election, and you see the same thing. In fact, here's what I found super interesting, just to see kind of the picture of all of this, is that you have, here's very pro-Ukrainian areas of Ukraine, and then you have kind of a mixed bag, 50 to 74%, and then you have kind of a little bit of a mixed bag here, but a little bit more pro-Russian here in this area of Ukraine. And then as you get closer to Russia, you have very high areas of highly populated pro-Russian and Russian people in these areas. And so very much you see this transition as you look throughout the country in 2014. And so what we were told in 2014 was that Russian forces came in to Ukraine from Russia, came from over here into these areas to take them over. So there was an invasion of Russia into Ukraine. And we can see this here, in this is Ukraine's deadliest day, the Battle of Ilovaisk, August 2014. So the BBC is talking about here that hundreds of soldiers died in the Ukrainian army, and volunteers retreated in a column from the eastern town of Ilovaisk on August 29th. uh, on the 29th of August 2014. And it says here the Ukrainian army had surrounded the town and the battalion had been ordered to wipe out the Russian backed force. But on 24th August, Ukraine's Independence Day, they began receiving calls from relatives. Ilovaisk was surrounded, Ukrainian media were reporting. And then it talks about how this conflict all of a sudden, you know, really amped up, and there was a huge battle. A lot of Ukrainian forces died, and so I started looking at all of this and said, okay, um, let's find the town of Ilovaisk, and you find it here in the Luhansk Donetsk region of Ukraine. Well, again, going back to 2014, you have a high Russian population in these two areas. So my first thought was, okay, if Russia had invaded Ukraine, what you would have expected was not that Russia comes into a heavily Russian populated area, because then a lot of Russians are going to die. So if Russia comes into Ukraine in this part, a lot of Russian people are going to die. What you would expect to see if the Russian forces invaded Ukraine would be if they invaded up here. And that's because then if you invade here, then you would see a lot of pro-Ukrainian population, or at least more than what you would see, more of a pro-Ukrainian view than what you would see here in the Luhansk and Donetsk area. Then you would see, so then I can understand, okay, if the Russian forces came into Ukraine over here, then that would make sense to say, that Russian forces invaded Ukraine. It doesn't make sense to me that the war is happening in these two areas, saying Russia has invaded Ukraine, because then a lot of Russian people, a lot of Russian supporters would die. And when you're talking about this city, the deadliest war is in Ilovaisk in 2014, and that's in the Donetsk area of Ukraine, highly Russian populated area, then to me it would make sense if the narrative was, or if we were told that Ukrainian forces came through and went into the highly Russian populated areas. And it's interesting to me that in 2014 you have the dispute in Crimea and in the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk area, which were the most highly populated pro-Russian areas even back to 2014. You can see that Donetsk is the most pro-Russian area in all of Ukraine in 2010. So to me, I wonder if the Ukrainian forces came into Ilovaisk, were ordered to wipe the Russian people out, instead of the narrative that Russian forces entered into Ukraine through a highly Russian populated area where a lot of Russian people would have died in Ukraine, and have the war begin here, or take place there. But regardless, that's just my view of what I think is more accurate in 2014 than what we were told. But again, apparently people call me pro-Russian and a Russian propagandist for talking like that. But what ended up happening is that countries in Europe and the US came together to form the Minsk Agreement to stop this fighting. And so it talks about Minsk 1 happening, a 12-point ceasefire deal happening September 2014, but 5 months, that agreement quickly broke down because there were violations on both sides. Then you have the Minsk 2 agreement. That was a 13-point agreement of February 2015. Leaders of France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine gathered, and of course with the support of the U.S. And UK, that these agreements, came up, and so then to stop the fighting. It says that what ended up happening was that the Ukrainian president at that time, Poroshenko, it says, negotiated in 2014. This is according to the Libertarian Institute. Negotiated in 2014-2015, the Minsk agreements represented the best opportunity for peace between Russia and Ukraine. The Minsk agreements were brokered by France and Germany, agreed to by Ukraine and Russia, and accepted by the United States and the United Nations. They promised to peacefully return the Donbass to Ukraine while granting it full autonomy. That means that if the Donbass area decided to become part of Russia, they could do that. That's the way that I understand granting full immunity or full autonomy. But Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president who negotiated, said that he had known that it would never be implemented because neither the political establishment nor public opinion in Ukraine would accept it. Right? We're not giving Russia this Ukrainian area. Right? According to Putin biographer Philip Short, though they had brokered the agreement, Germany did not push Poroshenko to implement it. According to Fedor Lukyanov, professor at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow, it was then said on the sidelines that Merkel actually did not advise Poroshenko to sign the proposed text. Though the U.S. officially accepted the Minsk agreements, they never did anything to encourage or force their implementation. There have also been reports that the U.S., the only party who could have really pressured Poroshenko, told him not to follow up on that agreement. Then it comes out that former Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2022. So this article was, I should have looked up the dates. Well, we know that it was probably around January 23rd. But in December of 2022, former Chancellor Angela Merkel had met with a newspaper, Die Zeit, and revealed more about the Minsk agreement. So it says that it was never really genuinely regarded Russia. It has never really genuinely regarded Russia as a dialogue partner. In an interview with German newspaper Die Zeit last week, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel revealed the West's real intention behind its negotiation with Russia and Ukraine to promote a ceasefire in 2014. She admitted that the Minsk agreements were an attempt to give Ukraine time and that Kyiv had used it to become stronger. In response, Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Friday that Merkel's remarks were completely unexpected and disappointing. The Minsk agreements intended to manage the Ukraine crisis and avoid escalating the conflict. Merkel actually confessed something Western politicians do not want to admit about the Minsk agreements. They were just a stopgap to buy time for Ukraine, and the West and Western countries have never put a real effort into resolving the differences with Russia over the Ukraine crisis. And then you also have, so then what happens? So then Russia invades in February of last year, and then in March, April, May, there are peace talks. And so one of the peace talks, it says here, according to TFI Global, that on May 12th, 2022, that Zelensky now throws Boris Johnson under the bus for fueling the war in Ukraine. Zelensky has thrown UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson under the bus. An explosive report published by the Ukrainian news portal, and Ukrainianska Pravda. Officials from the Ukrainian president's office have been quoted as alleging that peace talks between Russia and Ukraine got halted due to the pressure exerted by an unannounced visit by Boris Johnson to the country on April 9th. According to the report, Johnson came to Kyiv with the avowed objectives to express solidarity with the war-torn country and extend military and financial aid. However, the Ukrainian news portal has claimed that during a meeting with Zelensky, the UK Prime Minister asked him not to continue the peace talks that were going on in Turkey. It also claimed that Johnson asserted that Putin needs to be defeated. So this isn't about accomplishing peace. According to this article, it's not about accomplishing peace between Russia and Ukraine. It's about defeating Russia. And so then peace talks stalled. Again, here, according to Reuters, in April 20th, Johnson says Ukraine peace talks are doomed because of Crocodile Putin. And it says here in India, April 20th, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said any peace talks over Ukraine are likely to fail, as he compared holding talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin to negotiating with a crocodile. Johnson said dealing with Putin was like a crocodile when it got your leg in its jaws, and said it was vital that the West continues arming Ukraine. Now, days ago, this was published February 7, 2023, former Israeli PM Bennett says U.S. blocked his attempts at Russia-Ukraine peace deal. So when Israel, about 11 months ago, in March, was trying to mediate peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, this is what former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said in an interview posted on his YouTube channel on Saturday, that the U.S. and Western allies blocked his efforts of mediating between Russia and Ukraine to bring an end to the war in its early days. On March 4, 2022, Bennett traveled to Russia to meet with President Vladimir Putin. In an interview, he detailed his mediation at the time between Putin and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, which he said coordinated with the U.S., France, Germany, and the UK. Bennett said that both sides agreed to major concessions during his mediation effort. For the Russian side, he said they dropped denazification as a requirement for a ceasefire. Bennett denied denazification as the removal of Zelensky. During his meeting in Moscow with Putin, Bennett said that the Russian leader guaranteed he wouldn't try to kill Zelensky. So that's good. On the other concession Russia made, according to Bennett, is that they wouldn't seek the disarmament of Ukraine. For the Ukrainian side, Zelensky renounced that he would seek NATO membership, which Bennett said was the reason for Russia's invasion. Reports at the time reflect Bennett's comments and said Russia and Ukraine were softening their positions, citing Israeli officials. Axios reported on March 8 that Putin proposed is difficult for Zelensky to accept, but not as extreme as they anticipated. They said the proposal does include a regime change in Kyiv and allows Ukraine to keep its sovereignty. So things were being worked out, but then all of a sudden, all these peace talks ended. And so here, even as early as March, Israeli PM Bennett at the time said that the U.S. blocked his attempt for Russian-Ukraine peace deal. Then they meet in Turkey. They're working on an agreement, and Boris Johnson comes into the picture and halts peace talks there. And so we're seeing, and then here another from First Post, ex-Israeli PM Naftali Bennett blames West for thwarting possibility of peace between Russia and Ukraine. Like, these are damning things that are being said, in my opinion, for how this war could have been ended, peace could have been resolved, and unfortunately, it seems that the goal is not peace in Ukraine, but to destroy Russia or to have a regime change in Russia. And it's all about defeating Russia. And so here I want you to, and again, this is just confirmation here. About the conversations and this article about former Prime Minister of Israel.
Doesn't want peace at all. Now we have more confirmation of this. This weekend, in fact, we now know that the peace was almost ironed out. This is remarkable. Peace was almost ironed out between Putin and Zelensky until NATO got in the way of it. So this is the former Prime Minister of Israel. This is Naftali Bennett. This is his first interview that he's done since leaving office. He sat down on Saturday to this interview and said that NATO blocked his efforts at brokering peace between Ukraine and Russia. So here's how David DeCamp over at antiwar.com puts it in text. And he says, on March 4th, 2022, Bennett traveled to Russia to meet with President Putin. In the interview, he details his meditation at the time mediation between Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky, which he said he coordinated with the United States, France, Germany, and the UK. Bennett said that both sides agreed to major concessions during his mediation effort. But ultimately, the Western leaders opposed Bennett's efforts. He says, quote, I'll say this in the broad sense. I think there was a legitimate decision by the West to keep striking Putin and not negotiate, Bennett said. When asked if the Western powers blocked the mediation efforts, Bennett said, basically, yes, they blocked it. And I thought they were wrong. Admission from the Israeli Prime Minister, who was in the room where it happened. Caitlin Johnstone takes it one step further and says, she writes, in March of last year, Bloomberg's Niall Ferguson reported that sources in the US and UK governments had told him the real goal of Western powers in this conflict is not to negotiate peace or end the war quickly, but to prolong it in order to bleed Putin and achieve regime change in Moscow. Ferguson wrote that he has reached the conclusion that the US intends to keep this war going, and he says he has other sources to corroborate this.
So we have a problem here. Because one of the things that we've been told by both sides, in whether you talk to Democrats or whether you talk to Republicans in America, you saw House Speaker Kevin McCarthy during his his election to being House Speaker, wearing a Ukrainian handkerchief, colored handkerchief in his suit pocket, right? So you've got, so both parties are in favor of continuing to fund this war. One of the things, and I apologize, I just thought of this, is that Ukrainian defense minister. Okay. So according to the BBC, on January 13th of 2023, it says that Ukraine has become a de facto member of the NATO alliance. The Ukrainian defense minister says as Western countries, once concerned that military assistance could be seen in escalation by Russia, changed their thinking approach. In an interview with BBC, Oleksiy Reznikov said he was sure Ukraine would receive long-sought weapons, including tanks and fighter jets. Now remember, according to, I should have done a little bit more work here. Biden, I'm going to show you how what Biden said about World War III. Let's just listen here.
On NATO, we're going to make sure Ukraine has the weapons to defend themselves from invading Russian force. We will send money and food aid to save Ukrainian lives. We're going to welcome Ukrainian refugees with open arms if, in fact, they come all the way here. And as we provide the support to Ukraine, we're going to continue to stand together with our allies in Europe and send an unmistakable message that we will defend every inch of NATO territory, every single inch, with a united, galvanized NATO. One movement. That's why I moved over 12,000 American forces along the borders with Russia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Romania, etc. Because they move once. Granted, if we respond, it is World War III, but we have a sacred obligation on NATO territory, a sacred obligation, Article 5. And we will not, although we will not fight the Third World War in Ukraine. Putin's war against Ukraine will never be a victory. Democrats are rising to meet the moment, relying rallying the world on the side of peace and security. We're showing a strength that will never falter. But look, the idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks and trains going in with American pilots and American crews, just understand, don't kid yourself, no matter what you all say, that's called World War III. Okay?
So we have it there from the President of the United States that's sending tanks, jets, and this was 10 months ago. Okay, so tanks, jets, and American troops into Ukraine is World War III. All right, so let's go back to now. So now we know U.S. has said that they would send tanks. We know that the U.S. is selling tanks or jets to Poland. That the Polish forces are going to then send to Ukraine. So I guess American jets, even though they end up in Ukraine, not being sent by U.S. but sold to Poland, and then Poland will send them to Ukraine. I guess, well, that's, that maybe that's a big technicality. I don't know. But the point here is that we've got this Russian defense minister talking, to BBC, and it says here that that he was sure Ukraine would receive long-sought weapons, including tanks and fighter jets, as both Ukraine and Russia seem to be preparing for new offensives this spring. This concern about the next level of escalation for me is some kind of protocol, Mr. Reznikov said. Ukraine as a country and the armed forces of Ukraine became a member of NATO de facto, not de jure by law, because we have weaponry and understanding how to use it. Russian President Vladimir Putin has framed his invasion of Ukraine as an existential battle against Western countries that want to weaken Russia. Russian figures have argued they are fighting NATO in Ukraine, as the West has supplied the country with weapons in what they call a war of aggression. And so it says here, Ukraine for years has sought to join the military alliance between UK, Canada, and 28 European countries, something President Vladimir Putin has described as a security threat for Russia. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has pushed for fast-track accession, but it is unclear whether full membership is something the alliance members will seriously consider even after the war is over, despite pledges of support. Mr. Reznikov, however, denied that his comments would be seen as controversial, not only by Russia, but perhaps by NATO itself, as the alliance has taken steps not to be seen a party to the conflict. Why would it be controversial? It's true. It's a fact, Mr. Reznikov said. I'm sure that in the near future we'll become a member of NATO de jure. And so, I'm sorry, this is insanity. And so, what is really going on here? Well, in my opinion, of studying these things over probably the last 2 decades, is that I think that Russia, China, different countries like that don't bow to Western powers. I think that Russia and China have created their own somewhat independent economy apart from the West, and there's not a lot of leverage. And so the only thing to do then is regime change and try to weaken these economies. Now, I'm not a fan of Putin. I'm not a fan of Xi. I'm not a fan of the way that these nations govern. Okay, that I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. I'm saying they're both wrong. I'm saying that we have to take peace where it can be found. So if these two sides right now in the moment are willing to sit down and iron some sort of agreement for peace, then I think that they should do it. I'm not saying that Russia's right. I'm not saying that Ukraine is right or the West is right. I'm saying that both of these parties are wrong and this war needs to end. But the Bible talks about that it won't end. In fact, these escalations are predicted, that things will get worse and worse. When wars begin, they will continue to accelerate and get larger and larger. So how do we know this? How do we know where this is going to lead? Well, my conclusion is that the Bible talks about when Russia and these nations, because in BRICS nations we see Russia, China, India, South Africa, and then we see Turkey and Iran trying to become members of the BRICS nations. And when we look at Bible prophecy, it says that Russia and these other nations, some of these other nations, not all of them in the BRICS, but some of them, will be defeated at the war of Gog, Magog in Ezekiel 38. And I'll show you a video of that right away. But the point is that if that's the war that Russia and some of these other countries are going to be defeated in, then logic dictates that any war that they are a part of prior to that war, they win. So my assumption has always been, and like I said in the beginning, when it was so overwhelming that Russia would take Ukraine, that fit with biblical prophecy. I was like, yeah, like now when I hear people say, well, Ukraine is winning, I'm like, okay, maybe at that point, maybe Ukraine was winning. I don't know. I'm not on the battlefield, but I know from the big picture, Russia isn't going to lose the war in Ukraine. And if NATO and America decides to go to war against Russia, I know that Russia is not going to lose to NATO or to America. Which means that if there is a war between the US and Russia, or NATO and Russia, then those other parties going against Russia will lose, because the Bible tells us when this war that they're going to be defeated. So here's what I want to show you. There's a video by Pastor Andy Woods, and this was done 8 years ago. Okay, this is about a study in about Ezekiel 38, about a coming war in the future, the Gog-Magog war. And he talks about, and this is going to be a little bit longer because I want to use his study from 8 years ago. So this isn't about something that's using the headlines. He goes through who are the nations that Ezekiel talks about in this future war. And we're going to see how it ties in to right now. And this is one of the things that I want to talk about after he goes through the explanation of what does this mean for us. What should we expect? Should we prepare for? And how should we pray? How should we live as Christians in the world, knowing that this is what the Bible has talked about will come and will be fulfilled? So if you just bear with me, and we'll watch a little bit of Pastor Andy Woods' study.
Well, the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, and verses 1 through 7. I'm just going to read these verses to you. It says, "The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face towards Gog, the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, Tubal, and prophesy against them, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws. I will bring you out and all of your army and horses and horsemen, all of them splendidly attired, a great company with buckler and shield, all of them wielding swords. Persia, Ethiopia, Put with them, all with shield and helmet. Gomer with all its troops. Beth Togarmah from the remote parts of the north with all its troops, and then many peoples with you. Be prepared and prepare yourself and all your companies that you are assembled about you, and be guard for them." Now, what you discover here in these first 7 verses is you've discovered 9 names. They are Magog, Rosh, Meshach, Tubal, Persia, Put, Cush, Gomer, and Togarmah. Now, these are very strange names to us because if you pick up a copy of the morning newspaper, you won't see any names like this. What are these names and where did these names come from? Well, they're not understandable to us in the 21st century because these aren't names that we use, because Ezekiel is using names from his day. So these were all nations that he was very well familiar with. And if you want the origin of those nations, you could track it all the way back to Genesis chapter 10. And if you were to read verses 2 through 8, you would see almost all of these names mentioned, because Genesis 10 is a record of where Noah's descendants settled following the flood and so forth. And most of these nations are descendants of Japheth, and a few are descendants of Ham. And what essentially we can do is we can track the geographical areas where these different people groups beginning in Genesis 10 settled. And so the modern area that we know containing those people groups, I believe, gives us a very good clue as to who these invaders will be in the last days. So we're trying to figure out where did these groups settled and what modern nations that we know of today contain these people groups. Now, one of the things that our camp is accused of constantly in this area of Bible prophecy is we're accused of newspaper exegesis, where people basically say, well, you don't have any real weight behind what you're saying. All you're doing is reading the newspaper, and you're coming up with modern day countries, and you're reading it backwards into the Bible. And I am not against looking at current events, but what I'm against is people looking at current events first and the Bible second. What we need to do is look at the Bible first and current events second. That's a proper order, because we can be guilty of newspaper exegesis. So what I'm going to do in this first session may sound seem kind of tedious, but I want to show you the method that I'm using, because I want you to be confident that I'm using a scholarly method to determine who these different nations are. I'm not just hyping something up, to fit a prophetic scenario, as our camp sometimes is accused. And I'm using scholarly sources to do it. I'm using Josephus, a Jewish historian who wrote not too long after the time of Christ, and in his Antiquities, in book 1, chapter 6, sections 1 and 2, 1.6.1 and 2. He gives us a tremendous description of where these Noahic descendants settled. So I'm using that as a source. I'm also using BDB, which it's a Hebrew lexicon. It stands for Brown, Driver, and Briggs. And then I'm also using a scholarly source called Herodotus. Herodotus wrote a famous treatment called Histories, and he wrote within less than 100 years after Babylon fell to the Persians. He wrote about 450 BC right in there. So those are the sources that I'm looking at. And so what I'm going to do is try to show you where those people groups settled based on those scholarly sources that I just cited earlier. So let's start with the first name on the list. The first is Magog. And Josephus in his Antiquities 1.6.1, as you read that section, you'll discover that the Magog is called the Scythians. And basically any Encyclopedia Britannica will tell you that the Scythians migrated from Central Asia to southern Russia around the 8th to the 7th century BC. So who then is Magog? You can kind of track with me on the map. I think we're pretty good, pretty safe to say that Magog would represent the nations of Central Asia. So it would be all of those stans that are hard to pronounce, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan. I would even put the Ukraine into that group. The second name on the list is, or the next name that I'll give you is Rosh. And here I'm going to rely upon a scholar named Gesenius. Now, you have to understand that when I quote Gesenius, I'm not quoting, Jack Van Impe or somebody like that. You're talking about someone who, at his time, was the father of what we call modern-day lexicography, which is the science and art of compiling Hebrew lexicons and dictionaries. And based on his study of 10th century Byzantine writers, he believed that Rosh settled in what we call modern-day Russia. And what's very interesting about the work of Gesenius is he reached his conclusions in 1846 AD. So this was long before the Communist Revolution. This was long before the rise of the Soviet Union as a nuclear superpower. So it's not like he was reading the headlines and reading it backwards into the Bible. So based on what he says, Rosh probably, I believe, is Russia. And then you see two more names on the list. You see Meshach and Tubal. Now, if you believe in the inerrancy of the Scofield Reference Bible, you might get mad at me here because I'm going to disagree with the Scofield Reference Bible. How does that saying go? Our hope is built on nothing less than Scofield's Notes and Moody Press or something like that. A lot of good things in the Scofield Reference Bible, but when you look at the notes, it says that Meshach and Tubal represent Moscow or Russia and Tobolsk or Siberia. So it's connected with Russia, Meshach and Tubal. And the problem with that is Ezekiel 27, verse 13. Because Tubal and Meshach are mentioned as a trading partner of the king of Tyre. Tyre is modern-day Lebanon. So it's just really hard to imagine modern-day Lebanon, the king of Tyre, trading with these groups all the way in Russia, so far removed. So I don't think they're talking about Russia. Using the scholar Edwin Yamauchi, he says they represent Musku and Tabal, which would be modern-day Turkey. Herodotus, the source I mentioned earlier, in his histories, chapter 3, sections 93 and 94, chapter 7, section 78, he says Meshach and Tubal were a group of people living in the mountains southeast of the Black Sea. Now, if you look at the southeast of the Black Sea, that would be modern day Turkey. BDB, Brown Driver Briggs, on page 604, if you're interested, says Meshach in Persian times. Now, remember, Ezekiel prophesied just before Persia came to power. BDB says Meshach in Persian times was a people group southeast of the Black Sea, which we know today would be modern-day Turkey. Josephus, in his Antiquities, says that Meshach is an area called Cappadocia. Now, if you remember a little bit about the Bible, you might remember something about Cappadocia. Cappadocia is mentioned in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1. 1 Peter was written to a group of people in north-central Turkey. Cappadocia, I've got it there circled, is that group. So all of that being said, Meshach and Tubal, I believe, represent modern-day Turkey. And then you have another name on the list. I think this name is easiest to identify. It's the nation of Persia. And Persia, to me, is easier to identify than the others because Persia has a paper trail in the Bible. We read a lot about Persia. Persia was the second empire during the times of the Gentiles. Remember, Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He saw Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and he basically described a period of time called the times of the Gentiles, where the nation of Israel would be trampled down by various Gentile powers, and each part of the statue represented a different empire. So the head of gold was Babylon, which ruled from about 605 to 539. Ezekiel and Daniel were both taken away into the captivity under the reign of Babylon. And then came Persia. Persia came to power in 539 and overthrew Babylon. So there was a political sea change that took place, and you can read all about it in Daniel 5. Daniel chapter 5 is a record of that political sea change from Babylon to Persia. So Persia came to power. God worked in the Persians to the point where they ended up doing something good for the nation of Israel. God raised up a man named Cyrus. It's a copy here of the Cyrus cylinder. Cyrus is the one who released the nation of Israel from bondage and allowed them to go back into their homeland. And what's very interesting is the prophet Isaiah, probably 150 to 200 years before this happened, Isaiah predicted that God would raise up this man named Cyrus. Isaiah 44 and verse 28 says, "It is I, Cyrus, he is my shepherd." And then into the next chapter, Isaiah 45 and verse 1 says, "Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed." And it begins to describe how he would play this role in shepherding Israel back into the promised land. Now, Isaiah made that prediction 150 to 200 years before the man ever lived. That would be like saying 200 years ago, Barack Obama is going to be president of the United States. No one even knows who he is. Heck, we didn't even know who he was just a few years ago. And then lo and behold, a prophecy comes to pass and it's fulfilled. That virtually is the equivalent of what Isaiah is doing here. And liberals, of course, are so bothered by this that they say, well, that can't be. And they try to pretend that Isaiah didn't write that. And some other guy named Deutero-Isaiah or Trito-Isaiah wrote that. So liberals themselves, have been twisting in the wind trying to come up with a solution to this. But Persia actually ended up being one of the good guys in that sense. So it is under the empire of Persia that the nation of Israel goes back into the land after the 70-year captivity, and they go back in 3 waves, and I've got those outlined there on that particular chart. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah record this general time period. And we continue to read about Persia in the pages of God's Word. The whole book of Esther and the story of Haman and all of the things that happened there took place during the reign of Persia. Persia just continues right on through history as a political nation, all the way up until 1935 AD. And it's that time that Persia changed its name to Iran in 1939. And then Iran in 1979 became the Islamic Republic of Iran, or Iran, in 1979. And that was under the time period when Jimmy Carter was the president and the Shah was deposed and replaced by the Ayatollah. And we have a kind of a modern day country shifting into Islamic fundamentalism. And so I believe that when Ezekiel sees Persia, he is speaking of what we would call today the modern country of Iran. And then we have another name here called Cush. Josephus, in his Antiquities 1.6.2, calls Cush Ethiopia. And I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible. In fact, the New American Standard Bible is so confident that that Hebrew word Cush is Ethiopia that the English translation just uses the word Ethiopia. And so Cush is the Hebrew name, Ethiopia the English name, at least in the NASB. And so I think we're in pretty safe ground saying that Cush represents the modern nation of Ethiopia. Now, there's a note here in the Ryrie Study Bible on page 1323, at least the version that I have, talking about Cush. And the Ryrie Study Bible says this: the ancient country of Ethiopia encompassed far more territory than the modern country of Ethiopia. Since the ancient country included the northern Sudan. The Wycliffe Bible Encyclopedia says the same thing. It says the designation Ethiopia is misleading, for it did not refer to the modern state of Ethiopia. Cush bordered Egypt on the south, or the modern state of the Sudan. So I believe that Cush at least encompasses the Sudan. And then we run into another nation called Put. And the big question here is, where are we going to put, as the saying goes. BDB, page 806, says Put is Libya. And Josephus in his Antiquities 1.6.2 says Put is Libya. So taking a look at the map, you can see that I believe Put is Libya. And then we run into Gomer. Josephus in his Antiquities 1.6.1 calls Gomer Galatia. You say Galatia, I've heard that name before. Where have I heard that before? I know. That's where Paul went on his first missionary journey in Acts 13 and 14. He went into Galatia, and he was there for about a year. And then in his next his following two missionary journeys following the first one, he traced back through that exact same area. So Galatia, I believe, is the area that Paul went through, which today we call modern-day Turkey. And then, last but not least, we run into Togarmah. Again, Josephus in his Antiquities calls Togarmah Phrygia. Now, if you look at Acts 16:6 sometime, you'll see the word Phrygia. And this is what it says in Acts 16:6. It says, they passed through this would be Paul in his second missionary journey. They passed through the Phrygian and Galatian region, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. So Phrygia is this area in between Galatia and Asia that Paul passed through on missionary journey number 2. And that area connects with, as you can see on the map, modern day Turkey. So even if you don't agree with my conclusions, I hope you at least see the method that I'm using. There's a process that we're going through here. We're not just rushing into the Bible with the latest current event. We're using scholarly sources to track where these people groups settled, using especially Josephus, Herodotus, BDB, Gesenius, and other sources. So let's kind of review what we've looked at so far. Let me give them to you in a slightly different order. Put would be Libya. Cush would be the modern country of the Sudan. Persia would be Iran. Magog would be the countries of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and those other stans there. Rosh would be Russia. Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah would represent Turkey. Now, one of the issues that's very interesting is, did Ezekiel name every single nation that would be involved in this invasion? And the answer is no. This list that I've given you is not exhaustive, because if you take a look at Ezekiel 38 and you look at verse 6, at the very end of the verse, after it mentions Gomer and Beth Togarmah, it says, many peoples with you. So in other words, the Holy Spirit gave to Ezekiel the main players, but he didn't reveal to Ezekiel everything. There's others that Ezekiel didn't even name. Now, why is that point significant? Because in the eschatological studies of today, there has arisen a view by a man named Bill Salus, who wrote a book called Israelistine, I think is how you pronounce that. And I like Bill Salus. A lot of the things that he has said in his writings and his ministry I've appreciated, but he's come up with a theory that I think is slightly sketchy. And a lot of people are buying into it. And as I listen to this theory being touted on radio and TV, it's not touted as a theory, it's touted as something that will actually happen. So the theory comes from Psalm 83, and it's called the Psalm 83 War. And in Psalm 83, it mentions a group of nations that are adjacent to the nation of Israel, closer to the nation of Israel. It doesn't mention the names that are further removed from the nation of Israel that we just went through in Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 1 through 7. So according to the Salas scenario, what is going to happen is first there's a Psalm 83 war. And what is supposed to happen is Israel is supposed to be victorious in that war, and her territory is supposed to expand. And that creates the scenario whereby there's going to be a final invasion of the Gog-Magog war. And that's why the Gog-Magog war takes place while Israel is living in safety and peace and security, because that stage has been set through the Psalm 83 war. So you've got a Psalm 83 war, which sets the stage for the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war. And Salas believes that both events will take place before the Great Tribulation period even starts. He's very careful. He doesn't say before the rapture. It could be before the rapture, but he places both of these things prior to the 7-year period, a period of time that we call the 70th week of Daniel. Now, the reason I point out that Ezekiel doesn't mention all of the names is because the Salas conjecture is built on the idea that there have to be two wars because the names mentioned in Psalm 83 are different than the names mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39.
Okay, so the thing that I find interesting about what is happening today is just the fact that there is this war prophesied later on where, as you can see, even 8 years ago, Pastor Andy is talking about Russia, Ukraine, and that Russia would one day attack Israel. We want the nations that attack Israel. We see the Turkey moving from once being a NATO country, and it is technically still a NATO country, but you can see that is moving towards more of the Russian-China alliance and the BRICS nations. And that kind of, if you want to talk about East versus West or however you want to divide, you can see that shift that is currently happening in Turkey. Again, I'm not a prophet. I'm just a watchman. I'm just here to share my thoughts about what I think is going to happen. And so when we talk about the Russia-Ukraine situation, I totally believe, because of Scripture, that Russia will win the war in Ukraine. And maybe that's a bias that I listen to about, that, when I hear Russia is winning, then I'm like, okay, that makes sense. But it also comes down to what is the truth. When we go back and we look at news articles and stuff, like I said, everybody before the invasion began gave Ukraine 48 to 72 hours of survival time. So when you look at the equipment and everything that Russia had amassed, and now has been able to reinforce those positions over the last couple of months, then to me, I don't think it's so much as a bias as it is the truth. But like I said, scriptural wise, if this breakdown is accurate, which I believe it's probably one of the most accurate ones that I've ever come across of, because of the historical views. And the late Chuck Missler also did a view on the Gog-Magog war that I think is very extensive and very good as well. But you get the picture of what that area is going to look like and what's going to happen, in the future. And so when I hear of this potential NATO/American war against Russia, then I have to conclude, if that does happen, then it's not good for NATO/America, because Russia seems to, by the scholarly study, seems to be able to exist for this future war of Gog and Magog. And and how do we know that that time is approaching? Is because Israel exists. The Jewish people are in Israel. There is talk of, and this is why I do think Bill Silas might have a point, because there's a lot of nations that uh, Israel is in conflict with, and if they do to go to war, and so Israel exists, Russia exists, well then whoever they're in opposition, whoever they're in conflict with, will will lose, because those nations, amongst with the other ones, exist at that point, at this point in time. And so that is kind of how I view the lens that I view all of this with. And like I said, it's just sad for me to watch how it seems that America and the West, including um, you know and where we live in the West, is that it seems like that the goal of peace is not um, is not the goal. To have peace between Russia and Ukraine, and that it seems to be to defeat Russia and to go against Russia and to weaken it. And because Scripture talks about this, I just think it bodes poorly for America and for the West, long term. And so um, and so, how should we look at this as Christians? Well, again, our hope is not in an election. It's not in a nation. It's not in Western civilization or anything like that. Our hope is in Jesus Christ. And if God has told us in advance that these things are going to happen, and that if Russia, whether you agree with Russia or not, whether you think they're the the biggest, Putin's the next Hitler or whatever, the point is that Scripture talks about when these nations will be destroyed. When they come against Israel, then the wrath of God will be poured on these nations. He will decimate them. That is what the Bible talks about. So if you believe Scripture, then whether you think Russia is right or wrong, or Ukraine is right or wrong, America is right or wrong, it doesn't matter. The point is that Russia will exist till then, and whoever they come against, is going to be defeated. And this is like, okay, so then, and I don't know, maybe I'll do a further study of this in the next video, but why would God allow America then to fall against Russia, if that indeed plays out? Well, the question is, why would God allow some of the things that have happened in America and the West, the financial problems, the record high inflation, the struggle that Western people have had to go through, the challenge with heat and food? Why would um, God allow all that? And I think that's a great question for us to ask. And I think I'll try and put a video together to talk about that. But this one here, when we look at the war in Ukraine, what I think is going to happen is Russia will win in Ukraine. I think the rhetoric then will be amped up about the fear of Russia. Right now, he's going to go after Europe, rest of Europe. He's going to expand, and maybe Putin. That's what Putin wants. I don't think so. I don't think that because Russia has ever sent its full military into Ukraine, that it wanted to destroy Ukraine. I don't think that Russia ever wanted to overtake Ukraine, because there were so many Ukrainians. You saw that Ukrainian was a divided country. Why he doesn't have the Russian military doesn't have the assets to hold Ukraine? That was one of the conversations that many experts said is, okay, we think that Russia is going to take Ukraine very quickly. It's going to uh, it wasn't that they would win in Ukraine over that 48 to 72 hours, but holding Ukraine was the problem. The resources, and then the infighting and the militias and civil rebellion that would happen against Russian rule in Ukraine was going to be the hardest part. So taking Ukraine wasn't the challenge from many experts at the beginning of this. It was holding Ukraine, and I think that that's the thing, right? I don't think Putin wants Ukraine. I don't think he wants to constantly be at war with the people of Ukraine. I think what he's trying to do, is to say, look, we have this Russian population in Ukraine. They're being attacked. They were being attacked by Ukrainian forces back in 2014. We haven't seen any effort from the West to enforce the Minsk agreements, and now former Chancellor Angela Merkel said there was never any intention to um, abide by those agreements or to pressure Ukraine to uphold those agreements. Instead, they trained and gave military aid over since 2014 to Ukraine to set up and buy time for to bring this Ukrainian army up to this level where one day they could attack Russia, to bring all these resources, to bring that they're essentially a de facto NATO country, and with the resources to be able to have this proxy war with Russia. And I think it just happened sooner than what everybody had planned. I think and so Russia was able to move its forces and be more on the offensive than on the defensive had the roles been reversed. But the point of all this is that it's sad for me to watch that there's no effort of peace going on. And I think that this war, which started out as trying to protect an area of Russian population, maybe Putin has grandiose thoughts, but it just didn't seem that he never sent in all of his military into Ukraine to show the speed and the force and like that's how we saw Hitler do it, right? In Poland, just totally take his entire army and bulldoze its way across Europe, and seeing that it was this seemingly unstoppable force in Europe, which caused the rest of the world to say, okay, we need to get involved here. And I think that this is different. But again, I'm not Putin. I can't read his mind. But just from what I've observed, it seemed to be more about protecting the Russian people in the Donbass area in southern Ukraine, than it has been about taking Ukraine as a nation and more of Europe. But I think that when Russia wins in Ukraine, then I think that either NATO has to back down and say, okay, well, we lost this one. We sent all the tanks and weapons and everything that we could and all the aid, and we still, Ukraine still lost, but Russia hasn't attacked a NATO country, and so, it is what it is. And they basically, as some people have put it, take their ball and go home. Or do you create a situation where you now increase the level of the war, increase your involvement in the war from a NATO perspective or from an American perspective, right? That's the question. When Russia defeats Ukraine, what happens? Is the war going to escalate, or is the war going to end? And I think based on the biblical narrative, I think war is going to escalate. I think that NATO/America is going to find a reason to continue to fight with Russia in an effort to weaken or even destroy Russia. And I think that the biblical narrative and what the story of the Bible tells us is that they'll be unsuccessful in that.
I think that NATO and NATO countries, after all of these sanctions, all of the weapons, all of the money, all of the corruption that they've poured into Ukraine, they're just going to stop, say, okay, we're done. Okay, Donbass is now under full Russian control. We're just going to stop. We're going to stop lobbing missiles. We're going to stop with the F-16s. We're going to stop with the tanks. We're done. We're just going to go home now. I mean, you have the protests all over Paris, all over Germany. There's a big anti-war rally in the United States. Maybe the people will move the world to get them out of there, but I don't know how this ends. I mean, it either ends with NATO saying we're done, we're going home, we're picking up our ball and going home, or it ends with Russia cleaning the floor with NATO.
But whatever happens, as we watch things unfold, I think it's important to, as Christians, to stand back and take a look at how we got here, how peace was being attempted to. There was a peace agreement, attempts at peace agreement, and why they weren't successful. And I hopefully that this information helps you to have a different perspective. Regardless, I think we should pray for the Ukrainian people and the Russian people, for this, because I think that creating villains, out of this situation is not helpful. And people are being killed, people are being wounded, people are being displaced, their homes are being destroyed. And I think that we should pray for them. We should pray for peace. But hopefully, this helps with combating some of the narratives that are out there about how we got here, and some of the narratives of maybe that we're going to be told of why this war should escalate, and to pray for peace. And even though I think this war is going to escalate, maybe, our prayers and just our stance against escalating this war can at least prolong and bring about peace, and put off this time of war that the Bible talks about. And lives could be saved, and so I think that should be our prayer. And I think, continue to pray for the lost, continue to share Jesus and the hope of salvation with people, that he came and died for our sins, and that he's coming back again. And I think that as we look at the prophetic narrative, to understand and to, strive for peace, strive for preaching the gospel, but in our hearts know that God has a plan. And when it seems like evil is winning and bad things are happening, and we're losing ground, and it looks hopeless, to know that God has a plan. He's foretold these are the things, and he will work all things together for good. We might not be able to see it as things are unfolding, but he does have a plan, and I think that we need to trust in that. So I hope this helps, and I hope this has been a blessing to you, and you take care. I love you all, and share this video, like, subscribe if this has been a blessing to you. Take care. Bye for now.